How on earth do you decide what is right and what is wrong? Do we simply put it to the vote and go with the majority opinion? Or is there another way to decide absolutes? Especially these days, everyone seems to have a strong opinion about everything. My name is Ian Currey and this is Thinking Out Loud. But does what I think really matter? Come on, let's find out. Long ago, there was a time when our family traveled a great deal all over Europe. My job had us moving every few weeks from one place to another, and especially in the summer months. While this was fun and educational and even a rather splendid adventure, there were some drawbacks. Things that we like to do as a family are based largely on how we as parents grew up, of course. I grew up in the south of England, while Hilary grew up in Ireland, and so there are some rather significant differences in how we look at life. I've learned to love soda bread and how certain things are said, while Hilary has to put up with me watching cricket, for example. Now, these little things are no great hardship and have made our family rather fun, mostly. However, trying to raise a couple of boys and instilling some consistency was never going to be easy, as we moved across Europe from one distinct culture to another. But Dad, I know everyone puts mayonnaise on fries here, but it's still yucky. Or you'd look for milk to use on the breakfast cereal only to find it was sour yogurt or something like that. Ew. But food was never really a problem. But the way people think and act can quickly become an issue when trying to explain why it's not okay to act a particular way to a small boy. But Dad, everyone else does that and says that. And I'd find myself saying, just because everyone else does something does not make it right for you. Culture is one thing, but what about absolutes? Truth, justice, right and wrong. The way various cultures look at some of these things can get very interesting. Now, as parents of a travelling family, we often lived in a trailer for weeks at a time. My English friends would call that a caravan. With the wide variety of input going into the boys all day long, mostly good, but nevertheless different, reading stories at night was key. We could decide which stories, and we could determine at least that part of their cultural development. Robert, in particular, was keen on stories that involved cops and robbers. He would sometimes find one of the big boxes the crew I worked with hauled things around in and climb inside and claim he was in jail. Or he'd run around making me more noises, chasing imaginary bandits. As he grew, we found stories that would interest him, but that showed sometimes it wasn't the bad guys that got thrown in jail. The Book of Acts became a favourite weekly serial read at one point as we figured out who was going to go to jail this time and how they would escape. Let me show you how it worked. We might start off reading about how the apostles were working with sick people who were brought to them. Crowds came from the villages around Jerusalem bringing their sick and those possessed by evil spirits, and they were all healed. The apostles were clearly the goodies in this context, and as we read the story, Robert would start to realize the trend, and as I read, he'd giggle and say, "Uh-oh, the goodies are going to get it. They're going to end up in jail. How are they going to get out this time? As the apostles helped the sick and poor people, the high priest and his officials, who were Sadducees, were filled with jealousy. There we go, an overwhelmingly powerful group of officials who had the ability to throw people in jail because they got jealous. This will make a learning moment. They arrested the apostles and put them in the public jail. See, Dad, I told you the good guys were going to get it and get in trouble again. They'll get out though, don't you worry. But the angel of the Lord came at night, opened the gates of the jail, and brought them out. A lovely giggle from the boys. Yep, told you. When the high priest and his officials arrived, they convened the high council, the full assembly of the elders of Israel. Then they sent for the apostles to be brought from the jail for trial. The story seems simple enough. Okay, so there's a lot of interesting nuance bopping around in this story, not least of which is the religious leaders being the baddies. But for two small boys, the anticipation of the highest court in the land sending for prisoners that were already off out doing their thing again was the basis for a giggle fest. But when the temple guards went to the jail, the men were already gone. So they returned to the council and reported, the jail was securely locked with guards standing outside, but when we opened the gates, no one was there. Giggles turned to laughter. When the captain of the temple guard and the leading priests heard this, they were perplexed, wondering where it would all end. What are you reading them, dear? Hilary would ask as the boys giggled away in the back of the trailer. Oh, just the story about Peter going to jail. It's a guy thing. We're fine. Now, several thoughts for you. First of all, it occurred to me that if the religious leaders had been doing what they were supposed to be doing, instead of messing about throwing the goodies in jail, they would have known where the apostles were. They were right in the temple with the sick and the poor, perhaps where the religious leaders should have been. Then, what chance do you really think the few apostles had in front of that huge conglomeration of people? Clearly the leaders, judges, council, high priest, and whoever else all thought Peter and his friends needed to be given a very harsh sentence. The majority verdict was set before the case was ever heard. The outcome was inevitable. But was it right? You will find, if you read the rest of the story, that Peter and his friends are arrested again. And their defense basically says, we must obey God rather than any human authority. Or perhaps you could say, we must obey what is right, true, and just, rather than this biased court. The court's final decision was based on expedience and political stability rather than right and wrong too. The apostles were released after being flogged, but never gave up on doing the right thing. The next chapter of the story was, well, that's for another day, but it involves people telling lies to get another of the goodies arrested. This time the story didn't end so well. Stephen was unjustly stoned to death. Those long ago stories in the back of the caravan have more recently moved to our deck. Robert has grown, but still grins when we occasionally read of Peter or Paul going to jail. Because when you fight for the right thing, despite the consequences, it doesn't matter how many times you go to jail. God, the author of absolute, has your back. Does what I think matter? Well now, that rather depends where and how I'm forming my opinions, doesn't it? Until next time, goodbye.